what happens when a Hollywood legend, a man who built his career on grit and perseverance, is suddenly pushed to the edge on live television? In one of the most unforgettable moments caught on camera, Sylvester Stallone walked into what should have been a routine interview, only to face relentless questions that cut deeper than anyone expected. Instead of talking about his latest project, the conversation spiraled into a raw showdown about age, legacy, and respect. For millions watching, it wasn't just about movies anymore. It was about dignity, representation, and the clash between past and present. What unfolded wasn't scripted, wasn't rehearsed. It was a rare glimpse of a star fighting not for fame, but for his right to stand tall after decades in the spotlight. In the world of celebrity interviews, most moments come and go without much notice. A star promotes their latest film, a host asks a few predictable questions, and the audience politely claps. But every so often, something happens that shakes the entire format to its core. And that's exactly what viewers witnessed when Hollywood legend Sylvester Stallone sat across from Behar on live television. At first glance, the stage was set for a routine conversation. Stallone had arrived prepared, his usual professional demeanor intact. For decades, he had been the face of underdog heroes, characters like Rocky Balboa and John Rambo, who symbolized resilience in the face of impossible odds. To millions of Americans, Stallone wasn't just an actor. He was a cultural figure, a man whose story, from selling his dog to survive, to writing and starring in Rocky, became part of the American dream. Yet, on this particular day, the tone was different. The moment Behar leaned forward with her carefully prepared notes, the energy in the studio shifted. Her first question wasn't about Stallone's new project or his philanthropic work. Instead, it struck at something far more personal: his age. "You're still making action movies at your age. Don't you think it's time to step aside for younger actors?" The air grew heavy. Even the other co-hosts seemed unsettled. Whoopi Goldberg shifted in her chair, Sarah Haynes looked toward the producers, and the studio audience fell silent. For many watching at home, the question cut deeper than Hollywood gossip. It tapped into a much larger national conversation about generational divides, opportunity, and who gets to decide when someone's time is up. Stallone, calm but visibly firm, pushed back. He reminded everyone that Clint Eastwood had been making films well into his 80s, and that stories don't age simply because the actor telling them does. His words echoed a sentiment familiar to many Americans: the fight against being discarded, overlooked, or labeled too old to matter. But Joy wasn't finished. She pressed harder, challenging the value of Stallone's recent projects and suggesting his continued presence in Hollywood was more about ego than artistry. It was at this point that the interview stopped being a promotional piece and transformed into something much larger, a clash not just between a host and a guest, but between two worldviews. For Stallone, it was about legacy, respect, and the right to keep telling stories. For Joy, it was about challenging systems she viewed as outdated, monopolized, and resistant to change. And for the viewers at home, it was a rare, unscripted moment that blurred the line between entertainment and confrontation. Political in its undertones, cultural in its impact, and unforgettable in its delivery. The second Behar pressed her notes flat on the table, the mood shifted from tense to combative. What began as a simple promotional interview was about to unravel into something raw and politically charged. Her next question carried no hint of subtlety. "Isn't it true, Sly, that your recent success isn't really yours? Creed was Michael B. Jordan's movie. You were just there for nostalgia value, a relic of the past." The studio audience gasped, as if a line had been crossed. Whoopi Goldberg glanced nervously toward the producers, Sarah Haynes shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and even the camera operators seemed to tighten their grip on their equipment. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was provocation. Stallone didn't lash out immediately. Instead, he leaned forward, his jaw tightening, his voice calm but resonant. "Rocky isn't just nostalgia. He's a symbol. He represents every person who's ever been told they don't belong, every worker who's been knocked down and found the strength to get back up. Creed was Michael's story, yes, but Rocky's presence reminded people of the roots of perseverance." That answer should have ended it. But Joy wasn't finished. She cut in sharply, "Or maybe it's about money, Sly. These franchises, Rocky, Rambo, Expendables, they're cash cows. Isn't this more about ego and profit than about telling meaningful stories?" The silence that followed was deafening. In that moment, the interview became bigger than Stallone, bigger than Hollywood. It became a reflection of America's own debates, about age, legacy, opportunity, and who holds the right to space in industries long dominated by familiar faces. Stallone's response struck at the heart of those debates. I've been told my whole life I wasn't good enough, that I didn't fit the mold. When I wrote Rocky, the studios tried to buy my script but wanted to cast someone else. I refused. I fought for a chance to prove myself, not because of money, but because stories about working-class people mattered. They still matter today. This isn't about ego, Joy. It's about voice. The audience erupted in applause, not just for Stallone, but for the resilience he embodied. Viewers across America, many of them older workers, parents, and everyday people, saw their own struggles reflected in his words. The political undertone was clear. Was this simply about entertainment, or was it about the broader fight against being erased, whether by age, status, or circumstance? Joy, however, wasn't ready to retreat. She leaned in, her tone sharpened. But don't you think it's time to step aside for new, more diverse voices? And there it was, the question that would ignite the confrontation, framing Stallone not just as an actor defending his career, but as a man forced to defend his right to exist in the very industry he helped shape. The battle lines were drawn. For nearly 20 minutes, Sylvester Stallone had played the part of the professional guest. He smiled when necessary, answered with calm dignity, and tried to steer the conversation back to his work. But every time he built a bridge, Joy Behar lit a match and burned it down. The tension boiled over when she leaned forward, eyes fixed on him, and said, "Hollywood has a problem, Sly. Aging male stars keep recycling the same roles instead of making room for new, diverse talent. Isn't it time to step aside?" The words hung in the air like a gavel striking. It wasn't just a jab at Stallone, it was a challenge to his entire legacy. Even Whoopi Goldberg, normally unflappable, shifted in her chair, her eyes flashing with concern. For the first time, Stallone didn't just defend, he pushed back. His voice dropped into the unmistakable gravel that once carried Rocky Balboa through the streets of Philadelphia. "Joy, let me tell you something. I didn't inherit this career. Nobody opened doors for me. I sold my dog to survive while I was fighting to get Rocky made. The studios tried to take that script away, tried to erase me from my own story. I fought for it. And 50 years later, people still find strength in those characters. That isn't ego. That's perseverance." The studio fell into silence. Viewers at home could almost feel the weight of history pressing into the moment. This wasn't just an actor defending a role. It was a man defending the principle that working-class grit still has a place in an industry obsessed with youth and reinvention. Joy tried to interject, "But isn't this really about?" Yet Stallone didn't let her finish. He leaned forward, eyes locked on hers, and spoke with controlled fire. "You call it ego, I call it responsibility. People out there, in small towns, in cities across America, they grew up with Rocky, with Rambo, with stories about never quitting no matter how ugly life gets. You say I'm taking space. I say I'm holding a torch that still lights the way for people who feel forgotten." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then swelling into a wave. Even some of the other hosts nodded, recognizing the raw truth in his words. This was no longer just a celebrity interview. It had turned into a cultural showdown, a debate about age, relevance, and the politics of who deserves to keep telling their story in America's ever-changing spotlight. And for the first time, it wasn't Joy leading the charge. It was Stallone. The studio lights felt hotter than usual, as if they too sensed the storm brewing. Joy Behar wasn't letting go. She shuffled her stack of notes like a prosecutor preparing for cross-examination. With a tight smile, she fired her next shot. "Sly, let's be real. Isn't it less about perseverance and more about profit? These franchises, Rocky, Rambo, Expendables, they're cash cows. Aren't you just milking them for every dollar instead of letting Hollywood move forward?" The air grew heavy. The audience, once lively, sat frozen, waiting to see if Stallone would absorb the blow or finally explode. This time, he didn't hesitate. His voice, low but thunderous, carried across the table. "Profit? Joy, I wrote Rocky because I was broke and invisible. I wasn't part of any Hollywood elite. I didn't have connections. I had a story. And that story connected with millions of working-class people who saw themselves in that fighter from Philadelphia. You call it milking, I call it honoring the people who never give up." The words hit differently, less like a celebrity's defense, more like a cultural statement. Even Whoopi Goldberg, usually quick to intervene, stayed quiet. Sarah Haynes glanced nervously toward the producers, but no one dared cut to commercial. Joy leaned back, eyes narrowing. But don't you think Hollywood needs fresh blood, new voices, new faces, rather than the same old icons clinging to relevance? Stallone leaned forward, his jaw tight, his gravelly voice steady. Hollywood does need new voices. And I've given them that. I've produced films, mentored young directors, helped writers get their first break. Michael Bay. Jordan didn't just play Creed, he became Creed, and I stood behind him because I believe in passing the torch. But passing the torch doesn't mean setting myself on fire so someone else can feel warm. The line landed with the weight of a knockout punch. The audience gasped, and even a few claps broke through the silence. It was clear now, Stallone wasn't just defending himself, he was making a broader point about American culture. About the balance between honoring legacy and embracing progress. About how age, perseverance, and contribution should not be dismissed simply because they don't fit the current narrative of Hollywood politics. Joy, sensing the shift, tried one last push. Maybe you're just too sensitive to criticism. That was the moment Stallone snapped. He slammed his palm on the table, not out of rage but finality. His eyes locked on hers. Sensitive? I've taken more rejection and criticism in 5 decades than most people face in a lifetime. Don't mistake passion for fragility. I'm here because I refuse to quit, on myself, on my work, and on the people who still believe in it. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, Joy Behar had no comeback. For nearly 20 minutes, Sylvester Stallone had sat in his chair, holding his composure as Joy Behar pushed him harder than any Hollywood interviewer ever dared. But every fighter has a breaking point, and the man who built his career on embodying resilience was about to remind America what it looked like when patience snapped. Joy leaned in, her voice sharp and dismissive. Maybe this is just what happens when men get older, Sly. You can't take criticism anymore. Maybe it's time to step aside and let Hollywood evolve without you. The words cut through the studio like a lightning strike. Even the other hosts visibly recoiled, realizing instantly that the jab had gone too far. The audience, which had been tense, now shifted in unease. You could almost hear people holding their breath. Stallone's hand slammed against the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent studio. He rose from his seat with a speed that defied his age, towering over the table with the same intensity that once sent Apollo Creed, Clubber Lang, and Ivan Drago crashing to the mat. His voice boomed, controlled, but unmistakably furious. Criticism? You think I don't know what that is? I sold my dog to pay rent while chasing this dream. I was told I wasn't good-looking enough, not smart enough, not marketable enough. I've been told no more times than you can count. But I never quit. I fought for Rocky. I fought for every role, every script, every story. That's not ego, that's survival. The audience erupted into spontaneous applause. The energy shifted. This wasn't just a Hollywood spat anymore. It was an American underdog, once again standing tall against the odds. Joy tried to interrupt, but Stallone cut her off with a raised finger, his tone sharp as a blade. No. You've had your turn. Now it's mine. You want to lecture me about making space for the next generation? I've mentored young actors, funded new directors, and opened doors that were once shut to me. Don't confuse longevity with greed. Don't mistake persistence for arrogance. He leaned closer, his gravelly voice dropping to a quieter, almost dangerous tone. You call me old, outdated, irrelevant. But I'll tell you something, Joy, there are millions of people out there who see themselves in my stories. People who've been beaten down, counted out, told they're finished. And they keep fighting, because if Rocky Balboa can stand back up, so can they. That's not ego. That's hope. The audience was on its feet now, clapping and cheering. Even Whoopi Goldberg, usually the calm mediator, looked stunned. Stallone straightened his jacket, stared across the table, and added one last line that would echo across headlines. Respect isn't handed to you, it's earned. And I've been earning it for 50 years. Don't confuse your agenda with the truth. And with that, the studio knew, this interview would be remembered not for Joy's questions, but for Stallone's unshakable